Imagine a world where, well, the very foundations of understanding are shifting right under your feet, where something as basic as truth seems to be losing its grip.
Yeah, it's unsettling.
Our deep dive today is into precisely that kind of world, a world undergoing a profound transformation.
And we're using a really key text to navigate this.
Exactly. We're unpacking David F. Wells' seminal 1993 work, No Place for Truth.
A really powerful book.
It is. It offers this stark, pretty insightful critique of how modernity has reshaped not just our society, but, our very sense of self.
And maybe most surprisingly, the core of religious faith itself, especially within evangelicalism, which is Wells's focus.
He argues we're witnessing nothing less than the disappearance of theology itself.
Yeah.
A huge claim.
It really is. And think of it this way. If theology is kind of the structural integrity of a building, Wells is basically telling us the load-bearing walls are quietly crumbling.
Leaving just a hollowed-out shell behind.
Pretty much. So our mission here is to guide you through Wells's arguments. They're complex but crucial.
We want to explore the intricate ways that social forces, technology, and these fundamental shifts in how we see ourselves, how they've eroded objective truth.
And as a consequence, traditional faith. This isn't just some abstract academic problem, right?
Not at all.
It has profound everyday consequences for how you find meaning, how you navigate a world that feels increasingly chaotic, maybe centerless.
So we'll uncover the historical backdrop, how we got here.
The often unexpected consequences, too.
Right. And what this all means for you, the learner, trying to figure things out in a world that seems, less and less stable.
Get ready for some surprising facts, I think, and some insights that really challenge conventional wisdom about progress and belief.
Okay, let's dive in. Well, it starts by painting this really intriguing picture. Two overlapping eras. Western civilization and modernity. And he says they're often indistinguishable. Modernity isn't just something that came after the West, like a totally separate thing.
No, he says it's born aloft on the achievements of the West.
Born aloft. I like that. It's like the West built this incredible launching pad, right? Its ideas, its laws, science.
All of it.
And then modernity just sort of took off from that pad, using the structures the West created.
So it's a continuous flow, you could say, an internal evolution, maybe?
Yeah, rather than a clean break, one era doesn't just stop and the next one starts.
And this continuity, this idea that modernity is sort of an offspring of the West, not some invader.
Right.
That's precisely what makes the sunset of Western culture, as some call it, so alarming to so many thinkers.
It's like watching your own kid turn against the family legacy or something.
Exactly. Even back in the 19th century, sociologists started anticipating the West's decline. They thought it might collapse under its own weight, its own complexity and success.
Wow. Even then.
Yeah. And Wells points to this growing chorus of voices, almost like prophets of doom, seeing the foundations crack.
Like who?
Well, people like Ernst Troeltsch, who talked about that sunset of Western culture, and Jacques Ellul, who described a betrayal of the West.
A betrayal. That sounds intense. A betrayal of what?
Ellul argued it was a betrayal of the West's foundational values. The humanism, the spiritual depth that gave it purpose.
Okay.
Philip Rieff went even further. He saw an elaborate act of suicide by intellectuals.
Suicide? How so?
He meant they were actively dismantling the very possibility of objective authority, of shared truths that bind us together. It's a striking image, isn't it?
It really is. Like, the intellectual class was chipping away at the pillars instead of reinforcing them.
Precisely. And you have others like Carl Henry, Pope John Paul II, Brian Wilson, all echoing these concerns, talking about the end of the West and anti-civilization, only rags and tatters left of what used to hold people together.
A real sense of unraveling, losing the glue.
Exactly that. A loss of social cohesion.
It's also fascinating how different viewpoints frame this whole thing, this perceived decay or maybe renewal.
Right. The interpretation varies wildly.
Take the Enlightenment perspective. For them, progress is inherently good. Yeah. It is renewal. So if you feel disillusioned or if society seems messy, that's just a symptom of decay, something to be fixed with more reason, more human effort.
Because the Enlightenment promised a world remade by human reason, right? Liberation from God, from the past, even from evil itself. Very optimistic.
Totally optimistic. Self-sufficient humanity.
But then you have the Judeo-Christian perspective, which often flips that script completely, offers a radical counter-narrative.
How so?
Well, from that view, a belief in progress itself could actually be a symptom of decay.
Because it puts humans at the center instead of God.
Exactly. It's a kind of self-deification, you could say. And feeling disillusion, that's maybe not bad. It could be the necessary first step toward a realistic appraisal of the world.
Facing reality, basically.
Right. Without which real renewal is impossible. Wells argues that even though those brazen promises of the Enlightenment might seem dead now,
after world wars and failed utopias.
Yeah, buried under all that rubble. The underlying premise, the seductive idea of human autonomy, freedom from external constraints.
That part simply refuses to die.
It just keeps going, feeding this illusion of progress, an illusion that hangs on even when the ideologies built on it are, as Wells puts it, hiding in embarrassment.
Okay, so with that intellectual context, it becomes really vital to grasp this distinction Wells makes. It sounds similar, but it's different. Modernization versus modernity.
Absolutely crucial distinction.
Wells clarifies that modernization is the process. The tangible external shifts.
Right.
Organizing society around cities for manufacturing, commerce,
right.
Driven by capitalism, technology.
The physical reshaping?
Exactly. Think about the scale of it. Wells mentioned projections of the urban population in the West hitting 95%, up from just 5% historically.
Agree.
That's a massive physical change to our environment.
And modernity, then, is the other side of the coin. It's the values, the internal consciousness that grows out of these huge social changes.
Yeah, right.
Wells talks about a dialectic here, basically a dynamic interplay, a two-way street.
Where the external context, our modernized society, shapes how we think.
Powerfully shapes it, yeah. And this is key, without completely determining it. It's not like society just dictates our thoughts.
We're shaped, but we still have some agency, some freedom.
Some capacity for independent thought, yes, even if it's constantly under pressure. Now, what's really new about our situation compared to older cities that were more like integrated communities.
It's different now.
In the West, cities have become primarily commuter hubs, centers for work, not really homes in the full sense.
Oh, okay.
And Wells says this creates a real strain on us to be amphibious.
Amphibious, like living in two worlds.
Exactly. Constantly moving between the world of personal relations, home, family, and the world of functional, often impersonal relations within the capitalistic machine.
That amphibious idea, shifting between home and the machine, definitely hits home. But I wonder, does Wells talk about the potential upside?
Like what?
Like, couldn't this anonymity, this detachment, also be seen as freeing? Freedom from the intense pressure of a small town where everyone knows your business.
Right.
More room for reinvention.
That's a really sharp question. And, while Wells definitely focuses more on the downsides, that viewpoint certainly gained traction. The idea of urban freedom.
But he emphasizes the problems.
He emphasizes how detachment can erode our sense of accountability. Think about modern production lines.
Okay.
The distance between the worker making something and the person buying it is huge now. This disengages workers from responsibility for, say, quality.
You don't know the person who made your shoes, right?
Yeah.
So there's less direct pride or shame involved.
Exactly. And this extends to public life, too. It gets cut loose from private moorings. Yeah. Accountability becomes vague, abstract. If everyone's anonymous, who's really responsible, it can lead to a kind of moral drift.
And technology, of course, is just turbocharging all of this.
Massively. It powerfully shifts our attention always to the future. And it makes efficiency the main, sometimes the only, ethic.
The big question becomes, what is faster or more productive is good?
Right. Regardless of the impact on the environment or the human cost.
And this isn't just factories, it's everywhere. How quickly we ditch our phones for a faster one, even if the old one works fine.
That constant push forward, rapid obsolescence, it dissolves our links to time, to place, to tradition, to anything that isn't new.
Modernity pulls people into these big, impersonal centers.
But paradoxically, Wells says, it makes those places centers of loneliness, despite the presence of the many who crowd into them.
Wow. Centers of loneliness.
Mass society just can't fulfill those deep human needs for real community, for belonging. So it forces individuals to look inward for meaning.
It's a strange feedback loop. The more globally connected we are, often via tech.
The more isolated we might feel personally, it's a core tension.
To make this less abstract, Wells gives us this fantastic case study, Wenham, Massachusetts.
Yeah, the Wenham example is brilliant.
Tiny town, incorporated way back in 1643. Just 7 square miles, and it stayed largely unchanged for centuries.
He calls it an aperture, a window to see the great changes that have engulfed our world.
It was described as a delicious paradise, full of exquisite charm and character, a real snapshot of a different time.
allowing us to see the before and after modernization really clearly.
So, early Wenham,
Mm-hmm.
defined by this strong Puritan ethos, right?
Absolutely. The Congregational Church wasn't just a building, it was the spiritual and social heart of the town.
The absolute center.
And the minister, truly the first citizen, huge moral and intellectual authority. Evangelical faith permeated everything.
Society, home, church, all woven together, providing total coherence to life.
People's private beliefs and public lives weren't separated like they often are today. Imagine that. Your spiritual life, family, civic duty, all one fabric.
Total coherence. That sounds intense.
It was, and this coherence shaped identity and values. Wells talks about the true woman ideals.
Piety, purity, submission,
Yeah.
which needs context, right? For Puritans, it was about distinct roles, not necessarily inequality.
Right. Equally valued partners, different roles, and domesticity. There's this great quote from a young Wenham woman, Hester Price.
What did she say?
Her poem mentioned her Bible and her cookbook are the books to make things go.
Slightly amused. Bible and cookbook? That's practical theology. No wonder they made houses and shoes to last.
Exactly. It paints a picture of a very grounded, tangible reality, not abstract.
The temperance movement from the evangelical awakening was also there, though maybe not everyone loved it.
Sure. But overall, you had this clear sense of place, deep community connections, and this feeling of permanence. People built things to endure.
But then, modernity starts creeping in.
Relentlessly. Almost invisibly at first, like water eroding rock.
Communication, travel. Slow at first in the 19th century, then boom.
Post office in Wenham, 1809. First telephone line, Boston Somerville, 1877, though it took time to reach Wenham.
Railroads cross-continent by 1869. Streetcars hit Wenham 1885. Ford's automobile 1896.
America, well, it says, began to shrink. Distant places felt closer. Outside influences arrived right on Wenham's doorstep.
The idea of local just started to blur.
And the thing that really sealed the deal, completed the transformation, television. By the 1950s, it wasn't just a gadget. It was a revolution.
Bringing events from anywhere in the world as they happen, right into your house, creating this weird omniscience.
Yeah, you could see things unfolding, sometimes with more detail than someone actually there. Think about the Kennedy assassination.
A shared national trauma, but experienced individually. Millions watching alone.
And that's the paradox Wells nails. This tech marvel connecting us globally also led to experience without community.
Seeing the world, feeling informed, even emotional, but alone. Passively consuming in the living room.
It replaced collective public experience with fragmented private consumption, like being at the world's biggest party, but you're the only guest in your own room.
This global connection, mostly through media like TV, fosters what Wells calls the world cliché culture.
A culture based nowhere specific, transcending local customs.
It's a rich recipient of the past, but has little recollection of that past. It just grabs historical snippets out of context.
Right. And in this culture, publicity replaces monuments. Statues are made of celluloid, not of stone.
Achievements become about personality, rarely about character. A celebrity photo op gets more attention than a statue honoring real achievement.
It leads to this profound loss of community, deep cultural amnesia. Wells talks about mankind in the mass.
Individuals feel disconnected, maybe form small groups, beatniks, skinheads, whatever.
They fly off and fashion their own worlds. But Wells says these rebels often lack anything solid to rebel against.
Because of that cultural amnesia, they don't remember the past they're supposedly rejecting.
Exactly. The rebellion is against. Nothing much. Or nothing with deep roots. So modern experience gets attuned to experience and to appearances, not to thought and character.
How things feel or look, not what they mean.
And what's so striking about Wenham's story as this microcosm of the West is the sheer speed of it all.
Its character, stable for centuries,
Was destroyed by modernity with the suddenness of the executioner's sword, and as irreversibly.
Wow, that's dramatic.
It wasn't planned, just impersonal forces, technology, capitalism marching on. That sense of permanence just vanished, replaced by this overwhelming feeling of irresistible change.
It shows how deeply and fast modernization can remake everything, even a place that seemed insulated.
Fundamentally altered in just a generation or two.
Okay, so having laid out this drastically reshaped world, Wells then really zooms in on the consequence that seems most painful for him.
What happens to faith? To theology?
Right, when the ground shifts like that, uses that famous Yeats line, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, and argues that in this mix of culture, psychology, belief, theology becomes the chief casualty.
It's a huge claim, not just diminished, but essentially disappeared.
So to get that, we need to understand what theology used to be historically.
Wells breaks it down into three essential connected parts. First, a confessional element.
Like the non-negotiable core, the bedrock truths.
Exactly, like an ancient constitution's principles. The faith once for all entrusted to the saints. It preserved the church's identity over time.
Okay, confession first, then.
Second, reflection. This was how you understood and applied that bedrock, connecting the confession to the world around you, bringing all of our thoughts into obedience to Christ.
Thinking God's thoughts after him in every situation.
Right. A dynamic process, not static. And third, the cultivation of virtues.
Outward living of it.
Yeah, the practical result. Grounded in both that confession and careful reflection. This whole framework gave Christian life a total coherence, an integrated way of being.
But Wells says this integrated thing is vanishing rapidly in two key places, starting with the academy,
where it should be studied rigorously.
But there he sees a fundamental loss of that confessional element. It's just gone.
Reflection gets cut loose from its biblical roots. It wanders off into Eastern spirituality, radical politics, feminist ideology, whatever's current.
So theology becomes just reflection of a philosophical nature, an academic game without real truth claims.
Pretty much. He argues the Enlightenment idea, the individual defines reality, plus how universities restructured. It made orthodox theology, with its claims of absolute truth from outside, simply unacceptable in many academic circles.
And this led to the shift to religious studies.
Exactly. Theology departments got replaced. The object of study became human experience, not the Bible or church teaching.
So you study about religion, its psychology, sociology, anthropology.
Empirically. You look at it from the outside, but you don't engage with it as true.
And this approach, while offering some insights into human behavior,
paradoxically narrows your view. You only see the structures of the self, the tribe, or society. You definitely don't access claims of divine revelation that way.
And then in the church itself, especially evangelicalism, Wells sees the same disappearance, but maybe for different reasons.
Yeah, a different angle. Here he says low culture and popular sentiment tend to define truth, not objective theology.
Meaning?
The nostrums of the therapeutic age, those quick fix, feel-good beliefs focused on personal well-being, self-health.
They replace confession. That deep acknowledgement of spiritual truth, repentance, forgiveness.
Right. Preaching gets psychologized. It becomes all about you, your feeling, your problems. Christian faith gets privatized. Reflection is reduced to just thought about oneself.
So the Christian life becomes a search for techniques.
Techniques with which to expand the church and master the self. Less about knowing God, more about feeling better or growing the numbers.
And Wells has evidence for this.
Oh yeah, some really compelling, almost shocking stuff. He cites an analysis of Leadership magazine, a big evangelical resource for pastors from 1980 to 88.
What did it find?
Get this. 80% of the material was on clergy crises, burnout, stress, etc. 13% on church management techniques.
Okay. And theology.
Less than 1% had any clear reference to scriptures, still less to any idea that is theological.
Less than 1%, even for biblical topics.
Even for things like temptation or church discipline. The magazine prioritized wisdom through professionalization, practical management tips over theological depth.
That's, wow, a stark indicator of the shift in focus, from God's truth to human technique.
Totally. And the transformation of Christianity today, another major evangelical magazine, shows the same trend. Compare 1959 to 1989.
What changed?
News coverage doubled, 20% to 40%. Scholarly book reviews got cut, 15% down to 9%. But the biggest drop,
biblical and doctrinal content,
plummeted from 36% down to just 8%.
And what replaced it?
Success stories and personal testimonies. They went from basically 0% to 19% of the content.
So truth became just a means to personal healing.
And holiness got overshadowed by wholeness. It's all about subjective experience, feeling good, not objective reality or moral transformation.
This shift leads right into the core of modernity's impact on the individual, the rise of the self movement.
Exactly. And the American character, Wells notes, has always been this paradox, a mix of intense individualism and conformity.
A fierce love of both freedom and equality, leading to contradictory impulses.
Americans don't really shy away from extremes, unlike maybe the British, and this tension shapes our whole idea of the self.
It's crucial here to contrast this modern self with, say, Reformation individualism. Where did that come from?
It was radical then too, but driven by something different. Ultimate divine accountability.
Meaning everyone stands directly before God, responsible for their choices.
Right, which led to this intense seriousness about life choices and pushing back against other authorities, state, church hierarchy, even the self if it conflicted with God's will.
The reformers also believed in human depravity, right? The corruption of the whole of human nature.
Which made them suspicious of the self, suspicious of unchecked reason. Luther called it the devil's whore, suspicious of feelings.
Yet they also affirmed individual dignity.
Immense dignity, precisely because humans are made in God's image and vocation. That meant destroying the false split between sacred and secular. All work was service to God.
But the Enlightenment took that seed of individualism and changed the accountability.
Dramatically. Wells says bluntly, modern children of the Enlightenment have themselves taken God's place.
Duty to yourself replaces duty to God. Self-interest becomes primary.
The individual becomes the ultimate judge of truth and value.
And as those external connections work, community, family, nation get weaker.
They become harder to hold on to.
Modernity subtly obliges us to psychologize life.
Yes, it forces us to relocate satisfaction, fulfillment, away from those fragile external things and into sources within ourselves.
We're pushed inward to become self-reliant for meaning because the outer world feels fragmented.
And this turning inward shows up in surprising places, even the drug culture.
How so?
Wells connects the rise in cocaine use, say from the 20s to the 80s, to this cultural belief. The idea that the rational self could be expanded, altered, transformed.
Providing heightened access to reality and new states of being through chemicals.
Exactly. The self, manipulated, became the new frontier, the source of ultimate experience, not seeking external truth, but generating internal states.
This fits with what Martin Buber called the silent God and the rising self.
Thinkers like Sartre, Nietzsche, Hölderlin, they articulated this cultural shift where God feels silent, dead, absent.
And this vacuum gets filled
by the manipulated self, believing it can find reality only through the self. Wells mentions C.G. Jung's idea of finding the subterranean God within your own unconscious as an early example. Internal search replacing external revelation.
This cultural mood then leads to David Riesman's classic idea, the other-directed individual.
Right. People whose identity isn't shaped by tradition or inner conviction anymore.
But by external signals, fashion, a media consensus, the views of a celluloid idol, the message of a rock star.
Exactly, which creates this new kind of conformity. It looks like individualism on the surface, everyone doing their own thing, but it's often a deep dependence on the crowd's fleeting preferences, a loss of genuine inner direction.
And television is the perfect tool for this other-directed person.
It provides this constant feed of what is important to society at any given moment. It normalizes modern self-absorption, even deepens it.
TV gives us fleeting images for dramatic effect, not consistent ideas or deep arguments.
Leading to an overload on the fragile self. It's an endless stream of things to copy, want, consume, without the grounding of solid ideas or real community. Just a shallow, flickering mirror.
Daniel Yankeliewicz's research from '81 really highlighted this too, didn't it?
Yeah, he found this huge cultural shift. Duty to self, becoming the modern substitute for God, and expressing itself mainly in the search for affluence.
Interestingly, work became less central to identity.
Dramatically less central. The percentage saying work was central dropped from 34% in 1970 to just 13% in 1978.
And prosperity started being seen more as a right than an achievement.
Exactly. He compared it to continental plates, shifting a fundamental change in American values.
But this logic of individualism, pushed to the extreme, Wells argues, ends up in squalid decadence, the disorganization of the self.
The focus shifts away from building character or achieving things.
And lands purely on how you stand with others, how you're perceived.
Right, and freedom from constraints culture, family expectations, which seems great at first, actually fuels deep insecurity.
And that insecurity can only be soothed by seeing your grandiose self reflected back, affirmed by others.
It's a vicious cycle. Ultimately, Wells says, alienation becomes the bitter fruit of modern individualism. You're free, but utterly alone.
Okay, next, Wells brings in this idea of the every person in populist culture.
A fascinating product of this whole modern landscape.
who is every person.
Basically, the archetype forged by the American democratic experience. For this person, democracy isn't just politics, it's an entire worldview.
Characterized by the exaltation of the average, a middling standard.
Exactly. And this middling standard fosters a deep resentment of intellect.
Meaning?
Showing real intellect, deep knowledge, critical thought. It's often seen as aristocratic pretension. Un-American even.
If the middle is the standard, some have to be lifted up, but others
have to reduce themselves to fit. It stifles intellectual ambition because people fear seeming elitist or alienating the average person.
Ironically, the super successful capitalist system becomes the great unifier for every person.
Yeah, it inducts everyone into a common experience, having the same things, the same ideas, the same experiences.
The mass market creates this homogeneity, reinforces the middling standard. We all watch the same movies, buy the same stuff, consume the same media.
Leading to this kind of lowest common denominator culture.
And in this world, television again is the dominant cultural force.
It circumvents all elites. Cultural, intellectual, even religious. Yeah. It makes print culture, with its demands for focus and critical reading, feel increasingly irrelevant.
Values get transmitted through the video culture, through stories, emotions, images, not reasoned arguments.
TV produces this astounding plethora of sights, sounds, info, but instead of deep thought, it forces constant, often shallow choices. You're always entertained, maybe, but not really informed or challenged.
This cultural climate then leads to what Wells calls audience sovereignty in religion.
Meaning ideas get their legitimacy, their value, only within the marketplace itself.
Ideas have no intrinsic or self-evident value. Their worth is just based on popularity, how many people like them.
Exactly. The people's right to assign value is supreme. Even if it means all ideas, religions, lifestyles are seen as equally valid, equally indifferent, and equally undifferentiated.
Total relativism, which completely undermines any claim to objective truth, makes it almost impossible to say one belief is truer than another.
And consequently, leadership itself gets transformed, even in Christian circles.
Leaders become those who can mobilize mass opinion by holding moist fingers to sense the changes in the wind.
Constantly adjusting the message to what they think the audience wants.
Which is the opposite of Christ, Wells points out, who never tailored his teaching based on popular reception.
Right. This leads to blind leaders of the blind, Wells warns. Leaders who absorb popular culture's corruptions, intuition over reason, feeling over truth without even realizing it.
The pressure to be relevant, to conform to the audience, becomes huge, often sacrificing theological integrity.
Okay, let's shift into part 3, the ministry and the market, how the calling of clergy became professionalized.
Wells points to a big historical shift. Ministers used to have high social standing, a clear purpose at the center of community life.
But that started fading around the mid-19th century. Novels began portraying them as strained, unhappy figures, if not outright scoundrels. Their moral authority was eroding publicly.
That must have created discomfort, a crisis of identity for ministers.
Absolutely, and that discomfort was a key motivation for professionalization.
Clergy felt their traditional authority slipping, so they tried to gain standing like other rising professions.
Like doctors, lawyers, engineers. They sought control over specialized fields, formalized education, set boundaries, hoping to regain respect and relevance in the modern world.
A deliberate effort to fit in.
And professionals, Wells argues, became the new mandarins. Not just skilled workers, but dominant figures in capitalism. The bones and arteries of the system.
Which brought huge rewards and social prestige, making professional status highly desirable.
But interestingly, despite this rise of professions generally, there was a decreasing interest in ministry as a specific profession.
The numbers dropped significantly.
Yeah, college grads entering ministry went from 1 in 2 in the 1720s down to 1 in 6 by the early 1800s. Theology schools' share of professional training also fell through the 19th century.
Why the decline?
Wells suggests that for some early on, social prestige was the main draw. When that faded, so did the appeal. Ministry just couldn't compete with the status and money of secular professions.
This professionalization also brought impermanence and marketability into ministry.
Definitely. Historically, pastors stayed put for decades. Yale grads often served 30, 40 years in one place. Deep bonds.
What now?
Now, impermanence is common. Ministers wander from church to church, seldom finding a secure or long-lasting position. Lifelong commitment to one flock, largely gone. It reflects a transient, market-driven job approach.
And this constant need to move, to adapt, forces ministers to think in terms of marketability.
Wells argues it often takes priority over internal calling or spirituality. The market, what people want, what's popular, dictates what kind of ministry seems valuable.
So clergy end up catering to demand, not necessarily theological conviction, like a product needing constant reinvention.
Exactly like that. A consumer landscape.
And this shows up in the expanded managerial roles pastors are now expected to play.
Hugely. A 1934 study listed 5 roles: teacher, preacher, worship leader, pastor, administrator.
Standard stuff.
But by 1980, David Schuler's analysis found 9 roles, adding manager, planner, fundraiser, trainer, therapist, social activist.
And Wells concludes the managerial functions have plainly come to dominate. The pastor as CEO.
The core shift becomes management by truth, switching to management by technique.
That Leadership Magazine analysis again, all about managing problems, practical how-tos, not theological grounding.
Seeking actionable techniques for success, often sidestepping deep engagement with God's Word. Very pragmatic, results first.
This also leads to secular counterparts and loss of uniqueness.
Yeah, almost every ministry function finds a secular echo now. Preaching is like secular teaching or counseling. Evangelism is like sales. Pastoral counseling like psychotherapy.
It blurs the lines, dilutes what's unique about ministry.
Profoundly. Ministerial identity gets defined by competence. Mostly managerial or therapeutic rather than worthy character, a passion for truth, and wise love.
The unique spiritual calling gets watered down. Just another service industry.
And tragically, professionalization marginalizes theology even within seminary education itself, where ministers are trained. The curriculum's focus shifted away from theology that was taught a coherent body of divine knowledge and towards needs in the church that the minister will have to manage.
So students get specialist tools for different ministry tasks.
But they're left to find a unifying principle in the practice of ministry itself, not in theologically formulated knowledge of God.
The result. Graduates bright with the sheen of professionalization, but frequently devoid of any theological interest or ability. They know how to manage, but maybe not what to believe or why.
Okay, let's shift now to the mind in question. Pagan, biblical, modern. This is absolutely central to Wells's whole argument about how we see truth today.
He starts by noting that modern thought just kind of assumes progress, right? That the human spirit has progressed.
Which makes culturally older views, like the biblical ones, seem inherently of less value.
And this isn't just a small point. He calls it a secular salvation history, a this-worldly deliverance story.
Which fuels intellectual innovation, but also creates this dread of the past as if it were a plague. History isn't wisdom, it's an embarrassing relic to escape.
Tied to this is the idea that worldviews are immutable garments. You can't just slip back into an ancient worldview.
Because they're supposedly wed to the psychology of a particular age. The modern worldview, with its science and skepticism, supposedly makes thinking in terms of the supernatural or absolute truth impossible.
Like our brains are wired differently now. Ancient ideas just don't compute.
That's the assumption. Now, Wells acknowledges that social forces, rationalization, pluralization definitely influence how we think.
But he argues we haven't lost all freedom. We're not totally predetermined.
Right. It's never been proven we've lost all capacity to think freely about reality. However, he observes the modern mind often just defaults to pragmatism.
Where truth is often understood only in terms of what it means to each person.
Exactly. If it works for you, helps you cope, helps you achieve goals, then it's true for you, regardless of objective reality. A huge departure from how truth used to be understood.
To really grasp this modern mindset, Wells brilliantly contrasts it with the pagan mind. Specifically, ancient Greek paganism.
In paganism, how did they know the gods?
Primarily through nature and experience, crashing waves, fertile earth, violent storms. These generated myths to explain life.
Truth was sought in the meaning of experience, the felt divine presence around them, not in some external objective revelation.
And the supernatural was neither stable nor predictable.
No. Gods brought calamity out of spite or rivalry, reflecting nature's unpredictable, often scary forces.
There's also no nature-supernatural distinction.
Right. Nature was alive with divine presences. Every act hunting, sex was sacred, but could also anger the gods. A fluid, often fearful relationship.
Because of this intimate but volatile connection.
Intuition and imagination were seen as far more potent as vehicles of knowledge than reason. Dreams were crucial, a special means of access.
Divine power was felt as imminent. Sensed more than known.
Exactly. When disaster struck, intuition and magic were the go-to responses, not rational analysis or moral reflection.
Which is a stark contrast to the biblical mind. Wells says it's profoundly anchored in objective truth.
How does God reveal himself in the Bible?
Not mainly through nature or subjective feelings, but through history and word, grounded in objective and public history like the Exodus story.
Interpreted by God's divinely given word, the scriptures, not private insight, but shared narrative and revealed text. Verifiable.
This leads to seeing truth as absolute and authoritative.
The early Christians, Wells says, knew that their faith was absolutely true, that it could brook no rivals, and so they sought no compromises.
Not negotiable, a reality.
This unchanging gospel, passed down, seen as authoritative scripture, a divine standard, unquestioned until modernity challenged all external authority, it was external, demanding, universal truth, not subjective or relative.
The biblical mind also makes a clear distinction between natural and supernatural.
Absolutely. God isn't just in nature, he's transcendent. His acts go beyond nature. He asserts himself over pagan deities, like in the plagues against Egypt's gods.
Showing Yahweh's power over their supposed gods of the Nile, sun, cattle.
He's distinct from creation, so he can act on it in ways pagan gods couldn't.
History itself also gets a radically different meaning, not just cycles repeating.
No, it's linear history and redemptive purpose. Israel was wrenched free from thinking life was endless repetition. Biblical history moves towards a goal, a destination.
Towards God's redemptive purposes, culminating in Christ. It's going somewhere. A divine plan.
And Christ himself is the absolute center of this biblical truth.
His incarnation, death, resurrection, return. They bring the Old Testament story to its final fruition.
And the early Christians preached the Christ of that experience, what was externally true about Jesus, his life, death, resurrection as historical facts, not just their personal subjective feelings about him. The truth was outside themselves, objective.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, maybe unsettling. Wells argues the modern mind shows this profound convergence with paganism.
Like we're returning to an ancient way of thinking, just in modern clothes.
Exactly. Like the pagan mind, the modern mind understands truth only in terms of what it means to each person.
In our pragmatic culture, where utility is king, truth becomes whatever works for any given person.
Highly subjective, utilitarian, completely cut off from any external objective standard.
Which inevitably leads to the contraction of reality into the self. Wells says the first casualty of this is believing truth exists outside our own consciousness.
When that happens, theology becomes autobiography.
Yeah.
Just a personal story about me, not a truth about God. Losing public meaning.
Precisely. What you feel, what you experience, becomes the ultimate test of reality.
And if truth is so subjective, that naturally causes an erosion of the teaching office in the church.
If truth can't be declared, taught, required, because it's only meaningful to me, then what's the point of a teacher, especially a religious one?
What's left to teach?
Wells provocatively says that where biblical religion has recovered, so has the teaching office, because it insists on intelligent conviction based on objective, communicable truth.
Brian Wilson, the sociologist, talked about a plausibility crisis for Christian faith today.
Yeah, he observed that even for believers, their beliefs about the supernatural are rendered in large part irrelevant.
The social space gets emptied of theology where modernity takes hold. Beliefs get pushed to the margins, less central, less integrated.
You might believe, but it doesn't shape your public life or integrate with your worldview much beyond a private emotional space.
This convergence really peaks in what Wells calls the self-movement in evangelicalism,
where Christian faith gets defined not by objective truth,
but by seeking assurance of faith in terms of the efficacy of its subjective experience, how it makes you feel.
Exactly. Feeling becomes paramount. I feel religiously, therefore I am a self. And ministries pop up offering instant and painless access to reality.
Guaranteed by subjective feeling, reinforced by group-engendered emotions. It's spirituality optimized for comfort and self-affirmation.
Not necessarily for challenging transformation based on external truth.
So wrapping this up, our journey through Wells's No Place for Truth really shows this profound, unsettling transformation, cultural and spiritual.
We've seen how modernization, urbanization, capitalism, tech, media drastically reshaped the external world.
And that process, subtly but powerfully, led to modernity. The internal mindset, the values that prioritize the self, relativize truth, marginalize theology.
Even inside the church itself. The very forces the West unleashed now threaten its spiritual core. It's deeply ironic.
That's the disturbing irony. Wells really hits hard. Capitalism and technology, the engines of modernity, actually grew up right alongside Reformation faith, almost symbiotic.
But now, they act as powerful surrogates for God, creating a world where God is often excluded, pushed aside.
Wells says Christian faith, especially evangelicalism, has become perilously dependent on the modern world in which its faith no longer has a comfortable place.
And this coincidence of spiritual interests, secular society losing absolutes, the church losing theology, makes real reform incredibly difficult.
At the absolute heart of this decline, Wells argues, is losing the traditional biblical vision of God, especially his holiness.
When that goes, core terms like sin and grace become empty shells, just echoes.
Instead of a majestic, holy God, we get a God who is slick and slack, whose moral commands are just avuncular advice you can ignore.
His word becomes a plaything for subjective interpretation. His church, just a mall catering to the coin of needs, satisfying personal desires.
We end up seeking happiness, not righteousness, fulfillment, not being filled, satisfaction, not a holy dissatisfaction. The sacred gets tamed, tailored to our comfort zone.
What's so fascinating and provocative is Wells' conclusion. What the church needs isn't just revival,
which he warns often just papers over with fresh religious enthusiasm without fixing the root problem.
Right. What's needed is reformation, a radical process, putting to death the habits of the modern world within the church, consciously stripping away modernity's influence.
And this profound, almost surgical change, he insists, needs the intrusion of God and his grace, a call for divine help to restore what's lost.
And that's the ultimate challenge Wells leaves us with. If the church can find its place for theology again, refocus on God's centrality and sufficiency.
If it can recover its moral fiber, objective truth.
Then, and only then, will it have something truly meaningful to offer a world now drowning in modernity, a world adrift.
Which leaves a profound question for you, our listener. In a world where truth feels increasingly subjective, self-defined, where our experience often feels more real than objective facts, how do you discern what's truly relevant and what's just a reflection of modernity's pervasive but maybe ultimately shallow influence? It's a challenge to look for truth beyond the echo chamber of the self.